Look at all these beautiful cherry blossom trees here in Jackson Park, Chicago, at the Museum of Science and Industry, the last remaining structure from the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. It's so beautiful. But we're not here for beauty. We're here for darkness. In the early 1890s, Chicago was building something extraordinary, a grand fairground to house the World's Columbian Exposition, so extravagant and enormous and electrically lit that it was dubbed the White City. This World's Fair was to be like nothing ever seen before, from lavish halls showing off exciting new inventions, and scientific progress and the arts and the various talents and exports of the US states, to a proto-Epcot village allowing visitors to experience cultures of the world, to a huge number of newly developed and often odd food items and carnival attractions. The World's Fair of 1893, held in what is now Jackson Park on the south side, was a cultural and often problematic extravaganza that drew thousands upon thousands of visitors to the city, freshly recovered from the Great Chicago Fire that destroyed most of it. Chicago was ready to show the world that it could be a powerhouse of progress to match New York, London, and Paris. And among these newcomers to the city was a man named Herman Webster Mudgett, who had moved to the suburb of Englewood only 8 years prior. This man, a rather unusual doctor and druggist with a murky past, became better known under his pseudonym, H. Holmes, America's alleged first serial killer, who seemingly murdered anywhere from dozens to hundreds of fairgoers in his sick and twisted murder castle near the Exposition. His story was made especially famous in The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson, popularizing Holmes as one of the most dastardly, super-villainous men in US history. But here's the problem. In the 130 years since Holmes was hanged for his crimes, or rather, one crime, actually, the mythos surrounding him and his crimes has become ever muddled and confused as historians and journalists and bloggers tripped over themselves to breathlessly report the mind-boggling evil of this man, a demon-like, murderous creativity that seemingly rendered him inhuman beyond comprehension. It captivates our imaginations. It terrifies us. It is, in all likelihood, not very true at all. So what even is the truth about H. Holmes? Who really was he anyway? Come learn with me. But first, let's chat about how you can find a not scary evil doctor with today's sponsor, ZocDoc. Have you ever been finally working up the courage to find a doctor, only to hit so many walls that you just give up and tell yourself you're gonna deal with it later? Chronically ill person that I am, I'm constantly juggling all the doctors I need to see, as well as finding new ones. And when you're actually trying to be productive with your health, you don't have time to waste on accidentally ending up with a subpar doctor or making 10 billion phone calls, both things that can leave you super discouraged or prone to procrastination. But using ZocDoc has actually made this process so much less painful, letting me search and compare thousands of local and in-network doctors with reviews from actual patients and detailed doctor profiles. For instance, I'm hard of hearing and often have issues with my ears that I need to get checked up on, and by using ZocDoc to find a good and reliable ENT with actual openings that I don't need to wait months for, I'm able to stay on top of my issues and instantly book visits, sometimes even same-day appointments, depending on the doctor. And then the website lets me track my appointments and intake forms, so I never get buried or overwhelmed trying to keep everything organized. It's truly been a huge weight off my shoulders as someone trying to navigate the ever-frustrating and complex medical system, and now I'm actually becoming more on top of my health than I've ever been. ZocDoc has helped me finally have a process that didn't make me want to quit before I'd even started. I've managed to find doctors who actually listen to my concerns and give me tests that I've needed for a while. I know a lot of you can probably relate. Staying on top of your health is so important, and it doesn't need to be a minefield. I know how hard it is to find doctors and make appointments, and you deserve to have that process made easier. You can start prioritizing your health today by heading to ZocDoc.com/CasRow, linked in the description below, to get started and check that appointment off your to-do list. Thank you so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about H. Holmes. Chicago winning the heated battle to host the 1893 World's Fair was a big, big deal. This wasn't just America's chance to try and outshine the famous fair that was held in Paris in 1889. It was Chicago's chance to prove itself as the potential center of a new world power. Some of the nation's greatest architects joined forces to design what became known as the White City at a breakneck pace, constructing awe-inspiring pavilions and buildings that were truthfully not made to last. The only one that remains is actually now the Museum of Science and Industry, surrounded once a year by stunning cherry blossoms by the lake that once entertained fairgoers from far and wide.
Oh, it's the ghost!
The ghost of Egypt.
No, he's in Philadelphia.
The World's Columbian Exposition was the debut of a huge number of very bizarre things, which I've discussed in a previous video, but it was also the stage for good new inventions such as the Ferris wheel, Cracker Jack, and more, in addition to thousands of electric lights, which were shocking and new at the time. But just as now, Chicago back then had a bit of a shoddy reputation, as did most big cities. People coming from out of town were deeply worried about crime and scam artists. Hoping to educate newcomers, a number of educational guidebooks started popping up, like this one from 1892, Chicago Day and Night, which tried to inform tourists of the various types of characters that they might encounter in the city, as well as where to go to have fun or where to avoid, and occasionally included scandalous gossip or local stories. It writes in Chapter 8, Perils and Pitfalls, "One has not space at command to cite all the methods by which the unwary are fleeced out of their wealth. Besides, new and treacherous schemes are constantly being invented. It must not be supposed by this that all Chicagoans are dishonest, although many foolish people who contrive to get fleeced generally go home uttering loud cries at the greed and dishonesty of the big city by the lake. But as long as there are geese to be plucked, there will be rascals looking out for the chance to do the plucking." Well, there certainly was a rascal in Chicago looking out for the chance to pluck some geese. And it wasn't the ones that poop all over the lakefront. This rascal's name was H. Holmes, and by the time the World's Fair opened its doors on May 1st, 1893, Holmes was already being lashed through the media as the ruthless swindler and con man that he was. What he was not yet known as, but would come to be famous as, was a serial killer. The legend goes that H. Holmes constructed a hotel at 610 63rd Street in Englewood, 3 miles west of the fair, that was filled with strange chutes, secret passageways, trap doors and rooms, gas chambers and crematorium, acid-dissolving tanks, bone-bleaching tanks. This murder castle, as it was later dubbed, would be the site of, apparently, over 200 murders of unsuspecting fairgoers and people that Holmes knew personally, or those who got in his way. Described in one article as, quote, "the most perfect incarnation of abysmal and abnormal wickedness to pass from history into the lurid vagueness of legend," it's not hard to imagine that a sicko psychopath like Holmes would see the fair and its hordes of ignorant visitors from out of town as the prime opportunity to sate his thirst for blood, using a clever hotel setup, like a weird Rube Goldberg machine of death. That's how the story goes anyway. And if you read Eric Larson's famous 2003 book, Devil in the White City, that's certainly the story you know. Here's the problem though, almost none of that story is true. Well, Holmes certainly did murder people. At minimum, one person. He was only ever convicted of 1 murder, and the highest actually plausible number is 9 victims. So, still pretty fucking bad, but Holmes wasn't exactly what he was painted as in Devil in the White City, much less the media, because that image of him comes exclusively from the sensationalist newspaper articles about him from that era, articles that we have known are not entirely truthful for years, literally since they were written. Even back in the Victorian era, when newspapers were so unreliable and they were just lying left and right in order to sell papers, people pretty quickly debunked things that they figured out were not true. In some fairness, the availability of accurate info on Holmes when Larson was writing the book in 2002-ish was certainly limited. But the problem is, anyone with even just their little pinky toe dipped into the history world knows that the Victorians are not always reliable narrators, and their journalists much less so. Especially reporting on crime, because cops at the time were frequently not trained in forensics, even the rudimentary and inaccurate forensics that they had back then. It was often like vibes-only detective work, where you walk up and down the street and ask people if they've got any leads, or you go investigate the crime scene and you just kind of assume what might have been happening. This quickly became a problem in the Holmes case, and we'll get into that. Luckily, in the 20+ years since Devil in the White City was published, we've gotten a lot more research on Holmes in the pipeline, especially as new documents were uncovered, as they always are. Some of the best newer research on Holmes was done by one of my favorite Chicago historians, Adam Selzer, in his 2017 book. So a lot of the research in this video is coming in part from his hard work. Everyone say thank you, Adam, and go get a copy of his books. They're all really great. A big part of the issue with Holmes is that the newspapers weren't the only ones doing the work of turning rumor into accepted fact. Holmes himself was doing it too. Selzer writes, "No one did more to turn the gossip into legend than Holmes himself. The man was, beyond doubt, a pathological liar. He lied to his various wives, to his friends, to his lawyers, to his employees, to detectives, to reporters, and to everyone else, right down to the census man. He lied in his diary." As Holmes sat alone in a Philadelphia prison, waiting to be hanged for just one murder. I hate saying that, oh, only one murder. One is still too many, but, you know, compared to the 200+ number that gets thrown around. He bided his time by writing a fictitious autobiography and confession that he may not have even actually written himself, and lying to investigators, reporters, and even his own lawyer. As time went on, the legend he was spinning about himself grew bigger and bigger until it outgrew even him, expanding beyond his death. But who was Holmes really? Turns out, he wasn't even H.H. Holmes at all. He was in reality an awkward, shifty-eyed little man named Herman Webster Mudgett. Holmes was born in New Hampshire in 1861, and by all accounts had an exceptionally normal and even pleasant childhood. He had perfectly kind and attentive parents, he went to church, attended a prestigious school, and was well liked in the community for the most part. His mother went on to recall to the Boston Journal, "Herman was such a good little child. He was very pretty and loving, and I used to call him my little blue-eyed baby." Obviously, his mom is a very biased source. She never once doubted his innocence, so. She recalled that he was never even remotely cruel to animals, one of the most common indicators of concerning childhood behavior that often precludes being a serial killer. But no, he was well-behaved, studious, and upright, albeit a little arrogant and introverted. That is, except for one really strong character flaw. He was absolutely fixated on money and was increasingly apt to do anything to get it with very little remorse. As a teen, Mudgett began his streak of making bad long-term decisions when he possibly got secretly married to his first wife, Clara, at only 17 years old. They had a child together before Mudgett went to medical school, chasing after the promises of fortune from the patent medicine business. While studying in Vermont, he began sniffing around other women, including an elderly widow whose money he was probably interested in. Upon returning home, he had a brief teaching career before leaving again to study at the University of Michigan, this time with his wife and his baby son in tow. Poor Clara tried her best to support him, but Mudgett was becoming slowly very violent and ill-tempered, and after several rounds of domestic abuse, Clara took their son and returned to New Hampshire without her husband. It's fortunate she did, because If she had accompanied him to Chicago, it's possible she might have died there. In Ann Arbor, though, Mudgett became more and more fixated on dissecting cadavers. He took a strange delight in it, as his classmates noted. He already had the habit of pilfering body parts and bringing them to his room for personal study, a habit that horrified his Vermont landlady when she entered his room to sweep and uncovered a rotting dead baby under his bed. You know, just little medical student things. He also began concocting grand schemes with his buddies on how one could fake a death in order to defraud insurance companies. This would become a core event in his life because as soon as he finally did move to Chicago in 1886, using a train ticket he swindled from a friend, he made insurance fraud his main game. It sort of makes sense why he was becoming increasingly volatile and desperate, trying to make money through seedy means. He had spent the prior year in crippling debt and broke to near starvation, to the point where he went to the police station claiming he wanted to die, and the police let him sleep in a cell before they helped him find temporary employment. After that lowest of lows, he finally figured he no longer had anything to lose. He promptly changed his name to Harry Howard Holmes, got his pharmacist's license, and got married to a girl named Murda who gave birth to their daughter. He wasn't even divorced from his first wife. I mean, he was trying, though. He began working at a drugstore at 763rd Street, right across from where the murder castle would later be. He eventually bought the store from its owner, a young doctor named Elizabeth Holton, and her husband. It's possible that Holmes and Holton knew each other from the University of Michigan. Despite popular stories, the Holtons were not murdered by Holmes. They lived into old age with their children. Even more surprising is the fact that Holmes actually did pay her for the business. He didn't, however, pay most of the contractors he hired to construct his large building across the street. He cleverly put all the deeds to the land in his mother-in-law's name, so when the debt collectors and lawyers came knocking, he was able to claim he wasn't liable in the first place. His castle, as it was dubbed later, was originally 2 floors, with the ground level being a number of businesses and apartments above them. The 3rd floor was added later, when Holmes had the idea to offer hotel rooms for the nearby World's Fair. It's true that the building was built weird, but nothing about it was actually secret or indeed nefarious at all. The rooms and passages were well known by the business owners and tenants. So while he wasn't actually building a Winchester Mystery House style funhouse, he was getting up to no good with various scams and getting sued left and right. He often stole and resold various products, in particular a bunch of furniture that was later found hidden in the castle. At one point he constructed a gas generator in the basement and tried to sell it, but it was obviously just a chemistry trick. He even claimed to have an artisan well of mineral water, which was really just the city tap water. What can I say? The guy loved making a doohickey. Another apparent doohickey was the allegation that he had constructed a glass-bending machine in the basement in order to cremate the bodies of his victims, of course. That one is fake, mixed up with the real story of a fake glass company that he set up in Wicker Park to fish for investments. It's hard to say exactly when he first killed or who it was. We can reasonably attribute at least 9 victims to him, but any beyond that are really unreliable. And as soon as his name started floating around in the media, people began to accuse him of murdering just about anybody. Many victims attributed to Holmes, including ones he claimed to have killed himself, were either still alive at the time or literally didn't even exist. Holmes himself takes credit for 27 murders, and many criminals do take credit for crimes they've never done, but he also spent a lot of time in prison claiming that he was fully innocent. The guy just could not stop lying, so if he's not a reliable resource, who is? Certainly not the papers, which were taking interviews with anyone who wanted one and citing them as pure fact. Most of the mythos we have surrounding Holmes and the murder castle comes specifically from 3 or so tabloid exposés from out of town, because they weren't even written in Chicago, with no reporter on the ground, which were then reprinted by local papers such as the Chicago Tribune. This is how persistent myths start, and it happened constantly. At some point, Holmes began an affair with Julia, the ex-wife of one of the clerks in the castle, Ned Connor. Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl and Holmes went together to Michigan for Christmas in 1891, and Julia and Pearl were never seen again. It's almost certain that Holmes killed both of them, and he would later confess to accidentally killing Julia while performing an abortion on her. Investigators would later dig up remains in the castle basement that likely belonged to Pearl. The next year, Emmeline Cigrand took on work in the castle and possibly became another one of Holmes's many mistresses. She would disappear later in the year too, with Holmes claiming she had run off to be married. Her body was seemingly never found, but people have some theories. He also probably killed Nanny and Minnie Williams, who also worked in the castle and had inheritance and property that he was interested in stealing. Odds are, Holmes became an incidental resurrectionist. I've done a whole video on resurrectionists, which you definitely should check out, but it was essentially the term for dudes who dug up bodies to sell to medical institutions for dissection. Really good money, obviously not legal. Some resurrection men, like the infamous Burke and Hare, went so far as to kill people for their sales. A sort of home-growing of inventory, you could say. Holmes, in whatever murders he actually did, had bodies on his hands he needed to dispose of. What better way than to sell them? Making a quick buck was his primary MO after all. And we don't really know how many he might have done or if he actually did this, but it's a good theory. He wasn't the sort of killer who killed just to kill, or because it gave him pleasure. It was a means to an end, and that end was always in pursuit of the almighty dollar, or to cover his tracks. Historians and sociologists have argued over and over as to whether this means he even counts as a serial killer. If your definition is simply person with a body count over 3, then I suppose he was, although we can only speculate about all murders he's accused of except for one. Others specify a person is a serial killer based not only on their kill count, but also their motives and mindset. Selzer continues, in the past few decades, the trend has been to classify Holmes as what we now know as a serial killer, which implies that his murders were to satisfy some psychological drive or sexual perversion. This, though, is pure speculation, and not necessarily supported by any hard data about Holmes or his background. Much of it, really, is based on stories and quotes that came from particularly bad sources. The murders we can connect him to generally had a clear motive. Someone knew too much or was getting in his way and couldn't be trusted. The murders weren't simply for love of bloodshed, but a necessary part of furthering his swindling operations and protecting his lifestyle. And what better swindling operation could there be than a World's Fair hotel? This is the most titular part of the Holmes legend, that he trapped hundreds of fairgoers in his torture labyrinth and killed them. But in truth, we have no real evidence that the hotel third floor of the building ever actually had any guests. Holmes was far more concerned with the more lucrative scheme of baiting in hotel investors he could scam out of money before burning the place down, at least partially, to collect insurance money. Certainly more profitable and a lot less work than creatively murdering hundreds of guests. He did set fire to the building in 1893, but it didn't actually fully burn down. Of course, Holmes running afoul of his creditors and business dealings was what initially got his ass in hot water, long before the fair ever even opened. Look who it is! Mimi! Holmes' business partner, a man named Ben Pitezel, was likely helping him with the murders he did do. This will become important in a minute. By the time the fair was in full swing, Holmes' wronged creditors were hot on his tail and building a case against him. Holmes fled Chicago, and at some point he genuinely became an outlaw in the Wild West, which is so crazy that this part of his life is never talked about in the usual Holmes stories. He had a whole stint stealing horses in Texas for some reason. He went to Denver to steal insurance money, changed his name, got married a third time, this time to a big-eyed gal named Georgiana Yoke. Anyway, Holmes was up to no good trying to acquire Minnie's property down in Fort Worth, biding his time waiting for Georgiana to come into her own inheritance, while at the same time making his goon Ben Pitezel conduct the most dastardly scheme yet. He must take out a life insurance policy of $10,000, and fake his death. Now, Pitezel was just as much of a loser as Holmes was, and was just as keen on criming and scamming, all the while dragging his wife and kids along, which is really unfortunate given what is to come. On at least one occasion, he ended up in jail due to a crime that Holmes had him do. Pitezel moved his family to St. Louis while he and Holmes worked on the insurance scheme. But before they could do that, Holmes was arrested for a different crime that they were doing and ended up in prison, where he met the famous train robber Marion Hedgepeth. Holmes was fangirling the fuck out over meeting a famous criminal, so much so that he ended up blabbing to him all about him and Pitezel's life insurance plot. Hedgepeth directed Holmes to a skeezy lawyer named Jephthah Howe. And then when he got out of prison, Holmes, Georgiana, and Pitezel set off for Philadelphia. It's not very clear what changed between the two business partners, or if Holmes was scheming on top of the scheme all along, but on September 1st, Pitezel tried to back out of the deal. What do you mean you want to back out of the deal? Goons aren't supposed to do that. Holmes murdered Pitezel, strategically as he always did, with chloroform. It was probably a painless death in that case. And then he fashioned the room and body to look as though Pitezel had died in a pipe explosion. And he didn't do a very good job, so Holmes and Georgiana, who was completely unaware, hurriedly boarded a train to Indianapolis, and meanwhile an inventor named Eugene Smith had barged into the house looking for Pitezel to have a meeting with him. Unfortunately, he found Pitezel's corpse instead. It was a pretty dang obvious case of chloroform poisoning. Despite an initial verdict ruling that it was death by explosion, the investigation continued when Pitezel's wife, Carrie, found out about it through the news, which reported the death using Pitezel's pseudonym, Perry, and she became suspicious, despite Holmes insisting to her that, don't worry, Pitezel's fine, and he'll come home soon. Well, I don't know, if my husband runs off to Philadelphia to operate a life insurance fraud scheme that I know about, where he fakes his own death, and then he never comes home, obviously I'm gonna think that something might be up.
Figures I'd end up in Philadelphia.
But surprising nobody, Holmes wasted no time trying to go collect Pitezel's life insurance money. Unfortunately for Holmes, Fidelity Mutual had already smelled a rat. He did manage to successfully get the insurance money, part of which was paid out to that shifty lawyer that he had connected with via the train robber in prison, and then he went about shuffling Pitezel's 3 children around the country to keep investigators off their scent. Because by this point, the Pinkertons had gotten involved. And investigators were on the scent, detectives always tailing him and the family. He must have finally decided that the Pitezels were now a liability. He had slipped up too many times, and the children, Alice especially, who identified her father's body, could poke holes in his story. He brought the kids to Indianapolis and put them up in a hotel under the guise that he was their uncle. On October 10th, Holmes poisoned Howard Pitezel, the young son, and destroyed his remains by shoving them into a gas stove in a barn. Then he moved the 2 girls and Georgiana up to Detroit, but got the inkling that the Pinkerton detectives were hot on his ass and moved them up again to Toronto. He rented out a house under a fake name, most likely poisoned Alice and Nellie, and buried them in the cellar. He left shoddy work behind, far too much evidence, but he was out of town before it could catch up to him just yet. He and Georgiana trekked over to Vermont, Holmes likely planning on how he may kill the rest of the Pitezel family, who were also posted up over there, waiting to meet up with dead Ben, who Holmes kept telling them, oh, he'll show up any minute. Don't worry, guys, he'll show up any minute. Holmes would thankfully never succeed, though he probably tried. He returned briefly home to New Hampshire to see his family and his first wife, but probably got wise that he was being shadowed by Detective Rowe. Did not realize I have a personal connection to this story. H.H. Holmes was finally arrested in Boston, hilariously not for murder, but for his Texas horse thieving, because that's the only actual warrant he had at the time. But he was also being arrested based on the case against him from Fidelity Mutual, the insurance company. Holmes decided that he didn't want to go to prison in Texas. Fair. So he admitted to faking Ben Pitezel's death. As he prepared to stand trial in Philadelphia, the national news began catching up to his story at last, and the rest is history. as Holmes was being tried for fraud and possibly murder back in Philadelphia, people in Chicago became more cognizant of the story and remembered, hey, wait a minute, isn't that the guy who built the weird castle building in Englewood? He's wanted for murder? Didn't some odd things go on in there? Various urban legends had already been attached to the Holmes castle, especially regarding its various secret rooms, which weren't murder dens at all, but really just tools for Holmes' fraud schemes. The New York World published an inaccurate floor plan of the castle, making it look weirder than it was because they merged 2 floors, and giving various rooms spooky names like the mysterious closed room, the asphyxiation chamber, the hanging secret chamber. Elaborate rumors like this obviously blew up when eventually detectives made their way to Toronto and discovered the bodies of Alice and Nellie Peitzel in the basement of the rental home. This prompted the Chicago police, led by newly appointed police chief John Badenoch, who had no police background but was rather from the flour and feed sales business, to go into the Holmes castle and gut it, looking for anything else incriminating. Badenoch saw the Holmes case as a prime opportunity to prove his worth in his new title, and the newspapers saw the case as a fabulous story to make sales. A match made in heaven or hell. The coverage was daily and extensive, profiling any and all opinions or rumors about the case mixed in with some genuine facts, and the paper reporters were allowed full run of the building and even helped in the investigation. So reporters and cops were poking around the castle, basically being like, whoa, what a spooky shaft that is. Could it be a laundry chute? No, it must have been for Holmes to dump bodies down. Whoa, look at this large safe. Why is it lined with asbestos? To protect the contents in case of a fire? No, it must have been to soundproof the safe, so if he locked someone in there, no one can hear them scream. The Chicago Times-Herald reported, foul odors of gas and dead oil choked them. Boarded windows prevented the daylight from entering. A stench like that of decaying flesh made breathing difficult. They went deep into the damp earth. They came on an intricate mass of pipes, running from where they could not tell. The place was like one of the danksome dens of alchemists of old, deserted and mysterious. Death seems to stalk wherever the handiwork of Holmes is found. Meanwhile, it's literally just like a regular gross unfinished basement. In their defense, though, something horrid did happen during the investigation. But it was entirely the workers' fault. They were down there whacking away at walls, and they uncovered a gas tank. And for some reason started whacking that too. And then the tank started oozing nasty smelling gas, and the workers were like, all right boys, time for a lunch break. During which time, one of the men brought a lit candle next to the tank, and obviously it exploded. Luckily, no one died. It'd likely be the first deaths in the building that Holmes actually had nothing to do with. One detective, Norton, spent lots of time coming up with kooky ideas as to how Holmes killed people in the house, like hanging people in the 3-story shaft. Papers also claimed that Minnie and Nanny Williams were burned in a gas stove upstairs. Never mind that a regular gas stove cannot physically cremate a body. It's just not possible. Any claims that Holmes actually had a crematory furnace could not be proven. But they did find human remains of a child in the basement, possibly that of Pearl Connor. Soon enough, just about every person that locals just hadn't seen in a while was getting claimed to be a Holmes victim. Seemingly anyone who had simply been inside the Holmes castle was now announcing to the world that they had nearly not made it out alive, or that they had witnessed Holmes doing suspicious things like moving heavy trunks. A number of people who knew Holmes or the victims did interviews, but many of their accounts don't really hold up to scrutiny. Holmes himself, meanwhile, was actually not displeased by this raging inferno of legends being created about him. He encouraged them and added to them himself, filling journalists' heads with bonkers little lies about who he killed, how, and why. Things only got more wild when a skeleton articulator named Myron Chappell appeared on the scene. Chappell appeared before the police, claiming that Holmes had sold him a few corpses in the castle for Chappell to bring home and rig up as cleaned skeletons to sell to medical institutes. Adding fuel to the Holmes as resurrectionist theory, of course. He also had a tree at his house full of bones and a skull that he now believed were Holmes' victims. Chappell went into the basement with investigators and pointed to a certain spot, telling them that they would find a flesh-dissolving tank over there filled with acid, and a bone-bleaching pit buried over there. They did indeed find the tank, but it contained petroleum for glass bending, not acid. And the bleach tank didn't even exist. When police contacted the college that seemingly bought the Holmes bones from Chappell, they concluded that they'd never bought anything from Chappell in the first place. And then it turned out that the bones in his tree had been there for many years, and they were only thought suspicious by a neighbor after they read the news. To make matters worse, the police had gotten Chappell drunk to try and weasel info out of him, not realizing that Chappell notoriously made up stories when drunk, and then when he sobered up, he forgot that he was telling lies. So the Chappell story, which had been reported on widely, quickly dissolved as if in an acid tank. But outlets outside of Chicago didn't get the memo that he was a crank and continued publishing his tales as fact, further cementing the idea of the Holmes castle as a labyrinth of murderous tricks. And then on August 1st, an anonymous person told the Philadelphia Press, "I will tell you candidly, though, that Holmes has murdered more people than the 9 we have evidence of having met death at his hands. If you can make out a list of persons who disappeared in Chicago during the World's Fair and who had money in their possession, I will stake my reputation that a majority of them will be traced to the Holmes Castle on 63rd Street, and that their existence abruptly ended there." This is a turning point in the Holmes story, when people began to believe that he killed World's Fair goers. The New York World elaborated on this, unsurprisingly, as it was a well-known trash tabloid. It wrote, "The castle was built immediately preceding the opening of the World's Fair, and there are many reasons to believe that Holmes, just then entering his murderous career upon a wholesale scale, contemplated gathering in his victims among the visitors to Chicago. There are hundreds of people who went to Chicago to see the fair and were never heard of again. The list of the missing when the fair closed was a long one, and in the greater number foul play was suspected. Did these visitors to the fair, strangers in Chicago, find their way to Holmes Castle in answer to delusive advertisements sent out by him, never to be seen again?" Within a few months, Holmes finally stood trial for the murder of Ben Pitezel. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. While awaiting his punishment, Holmes wrote a bonkers confession of murdering 27 people, which was almost entirely made up. Of course, it was published far and wide, though. It's great news, and many papers elaborated on it with extra gruesome additions. After all, the man will be dead soon, and then he really can't defend himself anymore, can he? So, who cares? The New York World was also the first to imply that Holmes had devil eyes, and that there was a Holmes curse, where all of the people who went after Holmes died untimely deaths. A lot of them did, but, you know, I guess whether or not that's actually a curse or just time doing its thing in an era where a lot of people died young is up to you. Despite his confession, which he later admitted he only did because the press wanted a good story, so I gave them one, he swore by his own innocence as a murderer until the very end. On May 7th, 1896, he was led to the gallows, hooded, and said goodbye to the crowd before he was hanged. According to his final wishes, his body was entombed in cement so that the eager and morbid masses could not dig him up to dissect him, as they so desperately wanted to. That night, a crowd hovered around the Holmes castle, eager to see if any ghosts might appear now that their murderer had joined them. They saw nothing. As the years beyond Holmes' death drew on, the legend grew and grew. When a second World's Fair was held in Chicago in 1933, people revisited the story in the years after, when the Chicago Tribune published the first article calling the 63rd Street building the Murder Castle. It heavily embellished the already apocryphal story, repeating long-debunked yarns. The building was torn down shortly after in 1938, and the Englewood post office now stands in its place, across the street from an Aldi. There are, of course, legends that the USPS basement is still the basement from the original castle. The two properties don't really overlap. Maybe part of it is, but Adam Selzer himself was able to go down there and investigate. He made a really great video covering it.
You know, this is very similar to what the basement would have looked like at the time. And you can certainly see digging around down here without any lights like they were the first couple of days. You can see a rag and think, hey, bloody rag. Or you see a pipe and think, hey, murder weapon. Very easy to see how people would get into that mindset. Obviously, of all of the stuff down there, the mop wringer of death is probably my favorite.
He didn't find anything particularly unusual, but it's definitely spooky. In 1940, Herbert Asbury's book, Gem of the Prairie, included a wild chapter on Holmes, the first to claim he killed several hundred people. He was also the first author to claim that Holmes killed an elderly Dr. Holton to steal his drugstore. Never mind that Dr. Holton was a young woman, or that the basement was filled with medieval torture devices and a box full of lady skeletons, or that Holmes was a mad scientist seeking to produce a race of giants. Every time a new Holmes lie was published, it was added to the cauldron filled with H.H. Holmes' lies soup. And of course, this trend continues until the biggest keystone in the Holmes story of all, Devil in the White City. It includes a lot of genuinely factual details about the world's Columbian Exposition. So when you have a kernel of truth in a popcorn bag of myths, the average layperson isn't really going to be able to parse out what's myth or not. Larson's sources were flawed from the beginning, and I do have sympathy for the fact that he was working with a century of bunk. It's a fantastic story after all. It instantly made Holmes one of the world's most famous serial killers in popular culture. And as myth scaling goes, every time stories get repeated and then elaborated on a little bit by new authors, the new elaborations get folded into the myth's canon, and it just grows and grows. The embellishments that Larson himself added were then repeated as fact on blogs, TV, and the news. Repeat friend of the channel, Ghost Adventures, obviously couldn't resist exploring the haunts of H.H. Holmes in 2019. 2 years after Selzer published his book, fact-checking all the Holmes stuff. Some people even believe now that H.H. Holmes was the true identity of Jack the freaking Ripper. It just goes to show how easy it is for myths to be made. We love to latch on to the most fantastical version of events that affirms something we want to believe. And horrible as it is, people have always been morbidly fascinated by con men and serial killers. H.H. Holmes was prime entertainment for the public, and still is, unfair as it is for the few genuine victims he had. Because while H.H. Holmes didn't actually murder any World's Fair patrons, no hundreds of slain innocents, he still did actually kill people. At bare minimum 1, Ben Peitzel, most likely about 9. And many of them never got justice, and their stories were used as fodder to sell papers. Poor people who simply got in the way of a huge fucking loser who couldn't stop trying to scam people and commit insurance fraud. At the end of the day, none of this was about bloodthirst, it was greed. I'm not trying to break these myths for you in service of exonerating the reputation of H.H. Holmes. He doesn't deserve it. I just think that this story is a prime lesson that we all can learn from, especially in times like right now when it's so hard to parse fact from fiction and all news seems to be tailor-made to tap into our strongest fears and desires. Remember, fear and desire can make people do horrid things, even seemingly good people. Resist that urge, check your sources, and look out for each other. There is no murder castle. Thank you for learning with me about H.H. Holmes and his Chicago legends. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I've wanted to talk about this for years. I love World's Fair stuff and Chicago history stuff and spooky things. Don't forget to grab a copy of my graphic novel, Liberated: The Radical Art and Life of Claude Gahan, and until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and don't bring a lit candle near any gas tanks.